Are you ready to learn the shocking truth about how the new inhabitants of foggy Albion actually came into the world in the days of strict gentlemen, tight corsets, and voluminous dresses? We're used to romanticizing Victorian England while enjoying beautiful historical dramas, but the reality was far more terrifying and grim. Before we reveal this secret, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have the bell icon turned on. Our team regularly releases videos with incredible historical facts that you definitely weren't taught in history class. Subscribed? Great, then let's get started. You can't even imagine, but behind the tightly closed doors of those very same luxurious 19th century London mansions, events unfolded that today, in the 21st century, seem simply wild and unbelievable. What was considered absolutely normal back then now resembles more the plot of a psychological thriller. The fact is, the respected doctors of that refined era were guided by some very strange and at times downright dangerous beliefs. Imagine a society where feigned morality, false modesty, and strict rules of propriety completely overshadowed not only common sense, but also matters of life and death. Just think about it. The most complex procedures were often performed in complete darkness or by touch under thick sheets, just so as not to embarrass a noble patient. While science was trying to make progress, crucial medical discoveries capable of saving thousands of lives were categorically rejected by society and viewed as unacceptable, outrageous liberties. Be sure to watch this video all the way to the end, because in the finale, I'll reveal a startling detail that many prefer to keep quiet about. You'll learn how this fanatical, blind adherence to tradition nearly led to a real catastrophe at the very heart of the mighty British Empire. I assure you, after watching this video, you'll see the Victorian era through a completely different lens. Get comfortable, we're about to begin. What if I told you that everything you believed about Victorian medicine is a lie? 19th century doctors followed rules that would seem utterly insane to a modern person. The guiding principle of any medical intervention was the strictest, almost maniacal modesty. Doctors were strictly forbidden from looking at a woman during an examination. The entire process took place literally by touch, under the thick cover of heavy woolen blankets. The room was plunged into complete semi-darkness long before the start of this crucial event. Thick velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut, blocking out every single ray of the London sun. Candles were lit only in the farthest corners of the room, casting thick and eerie shadows on the walls. The doctor sat in a chair, turned away from the bed, and looked exclusively at the wall or the dark fireplace. Any eye contact was considered a gross violation of etiquette and could ruin a specialist's reputation forever. Etiquette required that the woman remain fully clothed in loose, multi-layered nightgowns. The fabric got tangled under the doctor's hands, creating additional and completely unnecessary obstacles to his work. Sometimes special sheets with small slits were used, which were tied to the edges of the bed in advance. This turned the doctor's work into an extremely difficult task, comparable to trying to untie a tight knot with one's eyes closed. At the same time, everyone involved in the process was required to maintain absolute silence and a stony expression. Husbands were strictly forbidden from being in the room. They waited for news on the lower floors of the house. Victorian society believed that the male psyche was incapable of withstanding such stress. Only maids and older female relatives were present in the room, passing the necessary items to the doctor. The doctor communicated with the patient exclusively through these intermediaries without addressing her directly. This atmosphere of alienation made the process even more frightening and incomprehensible for the woman herself. Even her pulse was taken with the strictest precautions and maximum social distancing. The doctor gently grasped the patient's wrist through a thin silk handkerchief, avoiding direct contact with her skin. A pocket watch and a gold chain was drawn from his frock coat pocket with ostentatious slowness. The specialist's face, meanwhile, was required to express deep thoughtfulness and a complete lack of emotion. Any display of empathy or sympathy was regarded as unprofessionalism and excessive sentimentality. All the furniture in the room was first covered with thick covers made of dark, stiff canvas. Carpets were removed or covered with special runners to preserve their pristine, expensive appearance. The air in the room quickly became stifling due to the lit fireplaces and tightly shut windows. Victorians were terrified of drafts, considering fresh air the primary source of all possible ailments. Consequently, the room was kept in stifling heat, exhausting all the assistants present. In such unbearable conditions, the doctor had to rely solely on his hearing and sense of touch. A single wrong move could lead to irreparable consequences, but visual inspection was strictly forbidden. Specialists spent years training the sensitivity of their fingers to compensate for the lack of a normal view. Some doctors even covered their eyes with blindfolds to demonstrate their absolute commitment to the rules of propriety. It was a true theatre of the absurd, where formalities were placed far above common sense. Surprisingly, the women themselves actively supported these strange and extremely impractical traditions. They had been raised with strict morals and were willing to endure any inconvenience to preserve their reputation. The idea of an open examination filled them with genuine horror and the deepest, most sincere indignation. Newspapers of the time published angry articles condemning any attempts to reform this secretive process. Society stubbornly clung to its prejudices, rejecting any arguments based on logic or the advancing science. The cost of such a modest doctor's services was incredibly high and accessible only to wealthy families. The poor relied on the help of neighbors or local midwives who operated in a much simpler manner. However, in high society, a doctor's prestige was determined precisely by his ability to observe these complex rituals. The more conventions accompanied his work, the more willingly people paid him enormous fees. Common sense completely yielded to the strict demands of fashion and high social status. Today, these rules seem like the invention of a mad writer. It's hard to believe that the most educated people in the empire voluntarily immersed themselves in this theatre of the absurd. But for the residents of Victorian London, this was an unshakable reality that determined a family's status and honour. We'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about such blind adherence to etiquette in defiance of common sense? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the appearance of Victorian-era medical luminaries? Forget the snow-white coats and sterile masks we're used to seeing in modern clinics. A London doctor would arrive on call wearing his oldest, most worn-out black frock coat. This garment was made of heavy woolen cloth and was almost never cleaned or washed. The fabric absorbed city dust, soot from fireplaces, and chemicals from pharmacies. The buttons on the frock coats were often replaced with simple strings, as the fabric became too stiff. The deep pockets held a whole arsenal of items, from pocket watches to unwashed medical instruments. A doctor might also put an unfinished cigar, a piece of chalk, or a dirty handkerchief in there. These pockets were a veritable treasure trove of unsanitary conditions, hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. Every time he took an instrument out of there, the doctor brought with him an invisible threat to the woman. Washing one's hands was considered a completely unnecessary and even offensive procedure for a true gentleman. Doctors were sincerely convinced that their social status guaranteed them absolute cleanliness. The idea that a respectable gentleman might carry invisible dirt on his hands seemed absurd. A doctor could calmly arrive straight from the streets of London, remove his top hat, and proceed with his duties. At best, he would lightly rinse his fingers in a basin of cold water, simply for the sake of propriety. The towels handed to the doctor were reused and washed only once a week. They bore traces of soot from candles, stains from various medicines, and street dust. The same towels were used to wipe down instruments, which were then returned to the bottomless pockets of his black frock coat. Maids saw nothing wrong with this, as resource conservation in households was strictly enforced. The concept of sterility simply did not exist in the minds of people at that time. The doctors' shoes also left much to be desired, as they walked a great deal on the dirty streets. 19th century London was covered in a thick layer of horse manure, coal dust, and industrial soot. Doctors did not take off their boots when entering the bedroom and left dirty footprints on expensive carpets. This was viewed as a necessary evil associated with a visit from an important and respected person. Cleaning the room began only after the doctor had completely finished his work and left. Trust in such specialists was based solely on their confident demeanor and high fees. The women unquestioningly followed every instruction from the man in the dirty frock coat, regarding him as an unchallengeable authority. The social hierarchy dictated its own rules, and arguing with the gentleman was unthinkable. Any doubts about the doctor's competence were nipped in the bud by the patient's own relatives. Their status shielded the doctors from any responsibility for the consequences of their negligent actions. It is astonishing how blind faith in authority can be when backed by the right social standing. People refused to see the obvious filth, entrusting their fates to those who did not even attempt to maintain basic cleanliness. Outward glamour and gentlemanly manners completely replaced true professionalism and care for patients. Why do you think society tolerated such a blatant state of affairs for so long and so stubbornly? In the next chapter, you will learn why the only remedy was officially declared utterly immoral. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the astonishing hypocrisy of British society at the time. In the mid-19th century, a remedy was discovered that could permanently relieve women of incredible suffering. We are talking about chloroform, a sweet-smelling gas that plunged a person into a deep and peaceful sleep. It would seem that this discovery should have been the greatest triumph of medicine and a gift to all Londoners. However, the reaction of conservative society turned out to be completely unpredictable and utterly paradoxical. The women themselves found themselves in a difficult situation, caught between the fear of pain and the fear of public condemnation. Asking for pain relief meant admitting to one's own weakness and being labelled an immoral woman. Neighbours and relatives might turn their backs on a woman who chose to avoid the trials prescribed by nature. In living rooms, people whispered about the few brave souls who secretly invited progressive doctors with a bottle of chloroform. This remedy became a symbol of rebellion against the stifling rules of Victorian morality. The procedure for using chloroform in those days was quite primitive and required great caution. The doctor simply dripped a little of the pungent liquid onto a thick handkerchief or a piece of velvet. This cloth was then held to the patient's face, and she was instructed to take several deep breaths. The dosage was determined entirely by eye, which sometimes led to the patient falling into a deep sleep. Nevertheless, even such a crude method provided incredible relief and calm at a critical moment. The situation began to change only after Queen Victoria herself took a revolutionary step. She decided to use chloroform, completely ignoring the advice of her conservative ministers and clergy. This bold move by the monarch sent shockwaves through London's high society. What had been considered utterly immoral just yesterday suddenly received royal approval. Doctors who had previously criticised the gas began hastily rewriting their scientific papers. Debates over the morality of pain relief became one of the most striking examples of Victorian hypocrisy. A society that calmly tolerated appalling poverty on the streets suddenly became concerned with the ethics of comfort. Men who had never experienced such suffering passionately debated the need to preserve it. It was a battle between a dogmatic past and a humane future, unfolding in every London bedroom. In the end, common sense prevailed, but this victory came at the cost of enormous effort. The story of chloroform perfectly illustrates how difficult it is for new ideas to break through the wall of prejudice. What seems to us today to be a basic human right required real courage in the Victorian era. Every step toward humane medicine was met with fierce resistance from defenders of harsh traditions. If you're just as amazed by these historical paradoxes, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us uncover even more fascinating facts about the past. Want to know a secret that will change your life and your perception of the entire 19th century? The main enemy of London women was not strict rules of propriety, nor even the rejection of chloroform. The real threat was completely invisible, lurking in the hands of those very same authoritative gentlemen in black frock coats. It was the mysterious puerperal fever which claimed more lives than any other cause of the time. Doctors called it a curse or bad air, categorically refusing to admit their own fault. Doctors of that era often combined their practice with the study of anatomy in basements. They might spend the morning dissecting specimens in the anatomy theatre without gloves or masks. Afterward, without even washing their hands with soap, they would go on house calls to wealthy London homes. No one saw the connection between a doctor's morning activities and the sudden fever in his female patients. Microscopes already existed, but the idea of tiny organisms seemed like a silly fairy tale to respectable gentlemen. The idea that one must wash one's hands thoroughly before an examination seemed offensive to London's luminaries. One Hungarian doctor attempted to prove that ordinary chlorinated water could stop the spread of the fever. The British medical community ridiculed him, calling his theory unscientific heresy. To acknowledge that this doctor was right would have meant admitting their own responsibility for countless tragedies. Pride and high social standing prevented these gentlemen from taking such a humiliating step. Instead of washing their hands, doctors continued to search for the causes of the fever in the environment. They blamed everything on the London fog, the proximity of the River Thames, and even poor diet. Thick books were published detailing the influence of the phases of the moon on women's health. Medicine resembled medieval alchemy more than an exact science based on facts and observations. Any attempts to introduce strict sanitary regulations hit a brick wall of snobbery and conservatism. The situation remained dire for several decades, despite advances in other sciences. It was not until the late 19th century that British doctors began to gradually realize the importance of antiseptics. The first publications appeared, cautiously suggesting that clean hands could save many lives. But even then, the process of implementing new rules was incredibly difficult, facing ridicule from old professors. Pride proved to be a much more persistent obstacle than a lack of technical capabilities. The price of this medical pride was incredibly high, as it was measured in a vast number of ruined lives. An entire generation of Londoners suffered because of the stubborn refusal of a few respected gentlemen to simply wash their hands with soap. For many years, these horrifying statistics were accepted as the inevitable price of living in a large, bustling city. What do you think was harder to change? Medical instruments or the very mindset of London society? In the next chapter, we'll descend to the lower floors of Victorian mansions and discover how ordinary servants coped with their hardships. Life in Victorian London was strictly divided by invisible barriers of social class. While complex rituals involving expensive doctors unfolded in the luxurious bedrooms on the second floor, a different life went on in the basements. Maids, cooks, and laundresses could not count on a visit from a distinguished gentleman in a black frock coat. Their bedrooms were cramped cubbyholes under the very roof or damp corners next to the hot kitchen. In these dark and uncomfortable quarters, working-class women relied solely on their own strength and the help of their friends. Paradoxically, the lack of money for an expensive doctor often became a true salvation for ordinary women. Specialists did not come to them straight from the dissection theatres, carrying deadly fever in their hands. They turned for help to local women, who were renowned for their wealth of life experience and simple, down-to-earth wisdom. These elderly women did not read Latin treatises, but they did have the habit of washing their hands before working. They wore clean white aprons, which were regularly boiled in large copper vats of soapy lye. The servants' rooms were never closed off with thick velvet curtains, as there simply weren't any. The cool London breeze freely entered through these small windows under the roof, providing natural ventilation. The poor could not afford to keep their fireplaces burning around the clock, so the air in their cramped quarters remained fresh. The absence of stifling heat and stale air prevented the spread of that very invisible threat that was destroying aristocratic women. Poverty dictated its own life-saving conditions, protecting ordinary women from the deadly medical prejudices of high society. On the lower floors, strong alcohol or decoctions of medicinal herbs were used as pain relievers. A bottle of cheap gin often replaced the expensive and inaccessible chloroform, which was a privilege of the wealthy. Local herbalists sold bundles of chamomile, willow bark, and mint, from which thick infusions were brewed. These simple folk remedies, of course, could not completely relieve the discomfort, but they provided some relief. In the world of the poor, no one gave a second thought to the morality of such pain relief, guided solely by the desire to help. Society's attitude toward women of different social classes was also diametrically opposed. The problems of aristocratic women were discussed in whispers, with deep sympathy and a touch of drama, in high society drawing rooms. At the same time, the difficulties faced by maids were viewed as an annoying disruption to the smooth running of the mansion. Employers often dismissed maids to avoid tarnishing the reputation of their respectable London home. Consequently, many young women concealed their condition until the very last moment, continuing to carry heavy buckets of coal. Thus, the social inequality of the Victorian era created a unique historical paradox. Poverty and a lack of access to the advanced medical technologies of the time provided the best protection against medical errors. Life in cramped little rooms without velvet curtains and reputable doctors turned out to be much safer than luxurious bedrooms. This counterintuitive truth was long hidden behind the facades of London's grand buildings. Only decades later did statistics prove that the cleanliness of a white lab coat was more important than the prestige of a black frock coat. What if everything you were taught became obsolete in an instant thanks to a simple glass device? By the middle of the century, optical technology had advanced significantly, and microscopes were no longer just expensive toys. Scientists gained the ability to peer into a world that had always been nearby but remained invisible to the human eye. Under the microscope's lenses, a whole universe of tiny and incredibly active organisms was revealed in an ordinary drop of water. This discovery was bound to overturn all the established medical canons of Victorian London, but it met with fierce resistance. The first researchers to speak out about the impact of these microorganisms on health were subjected to fierce criticism from their colleagues. London doctors indignantly rejected the idea that some invisible bugs could harm humans. It was much easier for them to believe in mystical miasmas, bad air, and the unfavourable alignment of the planets. Old professors openly laughed at the young enthusiasts who brought microscopes to medical conferences. The pride of the academic community prevented them from admitting that their long-held knowledge had turned out to be completely wrong. Young scientists spent hours in laboratories sketching the strange life forms discovered on dirty medical instruments. They tried to prove that the famous black surgical coats were literally teeming with these invisible killers. Their presentations at medical society meetings were interrupted by indignant shouts from respected gentlemen. New knowledge was undermining the established hierarchy, where a doctor's authority was determined by age and social status. Accepting the germ theory would mean a complete revolution in the rules of hygiene and medical conduct. However, the facts became increasingly stubborn, and it grew harder to ignore them with each passing year. Gradually, articles began to appear, proving a direct link between boiling instruments and a decrease in cases of the mysterious fever. Some daring surgeons began treating their hands and scalpels with a carbolic acid solution before each procedure. The smell of carbolic acid was sharp and unpleasant, but the results of its use exceeded even the wildest expectations. The rooms where the acid was used ceased to be traps filled with an invisible threat. Metal instruments with wooden and bone handles gradually became a thing of the past. They were replaced by all metal counterparts that could be thrown into boiling water without fear of damage. Leather satchels lined with dirty velvet were replaced by metal containers that were easy to clean. The modernization process was difficult, as the new instruments were expensive and took some getting used to, but the survival statistics spoke for themselves, forcing even the most stubborn conservatives to change their minds. The training of new doctors also underwent radical changes in light of the latest scientific discoveries. Students were taught the basics of bacteriology, with an emphasis on the importance of hand washing and sterilizing equipment. They no longer rushed from anatomy theaters straight to the homes of wealthy patients without thorough disinfection. A new generation of specialists was graduating from universities with a completely different understanding of the nature of things. For them, the microscope was not a fun toy, but an essential tool in the daily struggle for safety. Society, too, gradually began to realize the importance of cleanliness, changing its long-standing domestic habits. Newspapers stopped printing articles about the dangers of chloroform and began publishing advice on home hygiene. People began to air out their rooms more often, letting in fresh air, which had previously been considered the source of all diseases. Water and soap ceased to be mere symbols of morning hygiene, becoming the primary weapons for protecting one's home. It was a true cultural shift that changed the face of the British capital forever. The revolution in medicine did not occur thanks to magical potions, but thanks to observation and a willingness to admit mistakes. A simple optical instrument forced humanity to come down from the heavens to earth and pay attention to the invisible microcosm. Decades of misconceptions were finally replaced by an era of evidence-based science and strict sanitary regulations. Why do you think it is always so incredibly difficult for people to let go of their old beliefs, even the most destructive ones? In the next chapter, you'll learn about the surprising folk superstitions and traditions that London's leading doctors had to overcome. Victorian London, despite its status as the capital of a vast empire, was literally steeped in ancient superstitions. Many women sincerely believed that their well-being depended not on a doctor, but on observing a multitude of omens. Bouquets of dried rowan or thistle were often hung in rooms to ward off evil spirits and misfortune. An iron object, most often an old knife or a horseshoe, was always placed under the bed to symbolize strength and protection. Incredible concoctions that had nothing to do with medicine were often used as tonics. A popular recipe was crushed pearls mixed with warm wine and honey, which cost a fortune. The poor replaced the pearls with ordinary crushed eggshells, hoping for a similar magical effect of strengthening their vitality. These drinks sometimes caused serious digestive problems, only worsening the woman's overall condition, but belief in their miraculous power was so strong that refusing them was considered a bad omen. Great importance was also attached to the weather conditions outside the windows of a London mansion. Beginning the process during a thunderstorm or heavy fog was considered an extremely inauspicious sign, requiring additional protective measures. In such cases, special church candles were lit in the room and protective prayers were recited. If the sun was shining, however, this was seen as a blessing, guaranteeing an easy and swift outcome. Nature was perceived as an active participant in events, capable of both helping and harming. A woman's clothing was also subject to a multitude of superstitious rules and restrictions. Under no circumstances should the shirt be brand new, so as not to attract the attention of evil forces. Preference was given to old, well-worn items that already carried the owner's positive energy. A small amulet or a little pouch containing protective herbs sewn inside was always hung around the neck. These amulets could not be removed under any circumstances, even if they got in the way of the doctor during an examination. Progressive doctors tried to combat this ignorance by giving public lectures and publishing pamphlets. They explained that a horseshoe under the bed was no substitute for fresh air and boiled bedding. But overcoming superstitions passed down by word of mouth for centuries was far more difficult than inventing a microscope. Women nodded to the doctors, agreed with the arguments of science, and then secretly hid scissors under their pillows. Fear of the unknown made them cling to any straw offered by folk wisdom. It took several generations for the scientific approach to finally displace magical thinking from everyday life. The spread of literacy and the availability of popular science literature did their part, slowly changing society. Horseshoes and bundles of thistles gradually disappeared from London bedrooms, giving way to thermometers and clean soap. Nevertheless, this era of superstition left a huge mark on the history of British culture and everyday life. It showed just how vulnerable humans can be in the face of nature without a reliable foundation in scientific knowledge.
It's time for bed soon.
Medical instruments of the Victorian era resembled the tools of a blacksmith's shop more than they did delicate instruments. They were made of heavy metals, brass, bronze, and carbon steel, which quickly became covered in dark spots. The design of these instruments was massive and angular, and their very appearance inspired genuine awe. Doctors kept them in special wooden cases, lined with velvet or simply in deep pockets. The clang of this metal in the silence of the room often triggered genuine panic attacks in female patients. The main problem with these instruments was their complete unsuitability for proper cleaning and disinfection. The forceps and clamps had complex hinges where dirt and dust from the streets of London constantly accumulated. The handles were often adorned with intricate carvings in wood or ivory to emphasize the owner's status. The process of using such instruments took place practically blind, which made it even more risky. As we recall, rules of propriety forbade the doctor from looking at the patient, requiring him to work by touch. Attempting to correctly apply heavy metal forceps under a thick blanket turned into a veritable lottery. The slightest mistake or an incorrect hand movement could result in an irreparable tragedy for the entire family. Surprisingly, society considered this approach the pinnacle of professionalism and strict moral purity. The lack of reliable pain relief in the first half of the 19th century made the use of these instruments a real ordeal. Women were told to grit their teeth, bite down on a piece of thick leather, or simply endure the pain while clutching the bed rails. Sometimes, before the procedure began, the patient was given a large dose of strong port wine or laudanum to drink. Laudanum, which was an opium tincture, merely clouded the mind but did not solve the main problem. Doctors had to act as quickly as possible, which often affected the quality and precision of their work. It was only with the advent of the era of bacteriology that the design of medical instruments began to change radically for the better. Intricate carvings, mother-of-pearl inlays, and wooden handles disappeared, giving way to smooth surgical steel. The new instruments looked much simpler and more modest, but they could be easily disassembled and boiled. They became lighter, more comfortable to hold, and safer to use, thanks to a scientific approach to ergonomics. The aesthetics of luxury gave way to the austere and minimalist aesthetics of life-saving cleanliness and safety. Interestingly, the old, richly decorated instruments were not discarded but took pride of place in doctors' offices. Doctors displayed them in glass-fronted cabinets as symbols of their long and successful medical careers. These items became a kind of museum exhibit, a reminder of the dark days of Victorian surgery. Looking at them, a new generation of doctors marveled at how their predecessors could work with such crude equipment. This is clear evidence of how quickly technological progress can transform an entire industry. Today, these massive bronze and brass forceps can only be seen in historical medical museums. They serve as a silent reminder of the enormous price humanity paid for its mistakes. The journey from the dirty pockets of a black frock coat to sterile operating rooms was incredibly long and arduous, but it was precisely this journey that transformed medicine from a risky art into a precise and safe science. Every detail of modern equipment holds within it the memory of those harsh Victorian lessons.
Still much to learn.
The process by which society came to recognize the importance of hygiene was painfully slow and fraught with dramatic moments. It was not enough simply to invent the microscope and prove the existence of bacteria in scientific laboratories. It was necessary to break centuries-old traditions, change everyday habits, and overcome the arrogance of the aristocracy. Old-school doctors stubbornly continued to visit patients in their famous unwashed frock coats. They published angry rebuttals in newspapers, calling advocates of cleanliness charlatans and alarmists. One of the main obstacles to safety was the sheer cost of the new methods. Sterilization required enormous amounts of clean water, high-quality soap, and expensive carbolic acid solutions. Replacing all the upholstered furniture in delivery rooms with easily washable surfaces cost a fortune. Many hospitals for the poor simply did not have the budget for such large-scale sanitary reforms. Therefore, the new hygiene rules were initially accessible only to the wealthiest Londoners. Attitudes toward personal hygiene also changed. Previously, it had been considered an optional whim of the wealthy. London's water supply system was rapidly expanding, making clean water more accessible to all segments of the population. Soap production ceased to be a luxury, transforming into a mass market and inexpensive hygiene industry. Newspapers began publishing advice on how to wash hands properly and launder household linens. What had once seemed an unthinkable extravagance became a daily routine for British citizens. New departments dedicated to antiseptics and strict hygiene appeared at medical universities. Young students could no longer imagine their work without a white coat and constant hand washing. They laughed at the old tales that a dirty coat was a sign of great experience. A new generation of doctors entered the profession with a clear understanding of the importance of sterility in their work. They became the main proponents of new ideas, gradually pushing the old conservatives out of the healthcare market. Of course, old habits didn't disappear overnight, and many superstitions persisted among the people. In remote villages and poor neighborhoods, midwives still relied on herbs and incantations. But the overall trend was irreversible, and the trajectory of medical progress had forever changed course. Survival rates soared, proving right those who had fought for purity. The invisible threat that had terrorized London for decades began to gradually recede into the past. This era of great upheaval taught humanity a vital lesson about the cost of ignorance and pride. It turned out that saving thousands of lives sometimes depends on the simplest and most mundane things, like soap. The heroes of this era were not generals and politicians, but scientists with microscopes and persistent nurses. Their invisible struggle for cleanliness became the 19th century's greatest victory over prejudice. This triumph of reason forever changed humanity's approach to its health and safety. The end of the Victorian era marked a final farewell to the dark days of medical ignorance. London transformed from a city where miasmas and unwashed hands reigned into a centre of scientific progress. The streets became cleaner, and the first modern bathtubs and running water taps appeared in the homes of city dwellers. Society realized that the health of the nation begins not with prayers and amulets, but with basic hygiene. This long and difficult journey came at a tremendous cost, but the result fully justified all the suffering. The black surgical coats, once a symbol of pride, had finally become an object of ridicule. Their place was firmly taken by sterile white coats, which today are a universal symbol of medicine. Leather satchels lined with velvet were cast into the dustbin of history, along with old superstitions. Now every doctor was required to have a metal sterilizer for their shiny, smooth instruments. Rules of decorum gave way to strict safety protocols, mandatory for everyone without exception. The dreadful tradition of working blindly under heavy blankets also remained in the past forever. Doctors were able to examine patients properly, using bright lighting and common sense. No one accused them of immorality anymore, realizing that professionalism requires full control. Women ceased to be hostages to false modesty, risking their lives for the sake of their neighbors' opinions. It was a true liberation from the absurd social norms that had dictated their terms to medicine. The architecture of maternity hospitals and clinics took on the features we see today. Huge, bright windows, white walls, smooth floors, and impeccable cleanliness became the gold standard. No dusty velvet, no heavy curtains, and no stifling heat from fireplaces burning round the clock. The space began to work toward recovery, providing patients with maximum comfort and fresh air. This aesthetic of cleanliness and minimalism replaced the heavy opulence of Victorian bedrooms. The practices of simple midwives from poor neighborhoods were also carefully studied and reinterpreted by the scientific community. Their commitment to boiling aprons and sheets was recognized as an intuitive forerunner of antiseptics. Medicine stopped snobbishly dismissing folk wisdom and began to look for the rational kernel within it. Many useful practices were standardized and incorporated into the mandatory training of new nurses. Class boundaries in matters of health began to blur, giving way to uniform standards of care. Looking back at this history, we realize how fragile and relative any authority is without evidence. For years, people trusted those whose ignorance exposed them to incredible danger every day. Blind obedience to tradition proved far more terrifying than the lack of modern technology and sophisticated equipment. Progress came only when brave individuals emerged, ready to challenge the established system. Their perseverance and faith in the power of reason saved future generations of Londoners from an invisible threat. Today's achievements seem natural and self-evident to us from the moment we are born. We don't stop to think that the ability to simply wash one's hands with warm water was once a revolution. Every modern syringe, every mask, and every pair of disposable gloves comes at a high historical cost. They were paid for with the lives of those women who fell victim to Victorian pride and social conventions. This memory compels us to truly appreciate the benefits of modern evidence-based medicine. The history of the brutal reality of Victorian London is not merely a frightening tale of a dark past. It is a vital reminder that critical thinking must always prevail over tradition. No social status can serve as an excuse for ignorance and disregard for safety. The advancement of science is impossible without a willingness to acknowledge one's mistakes and constantly learn new things. It is this principle that has allowed humanity to step out of dark, stuffy rooms into a bright and safe future. We've travelled a long way through the dark corridors and luxurious bedrooms of Victorian London, uncovering its hidden secrets. This era has left us with many fascinating mysteries and incredible stories of overcoming human prejudice. Each of these stories teaches us to appreciate the level of safety we enjoy in the modern world.